Here are key topics you should revise for EU law in particular: free movement of goods, free movement of persons, EU citizenship, EU institutions, preliminary rulings, and annulment. Most importantly, you should use the ARAC structure. First of all, you need to say what is the legal issue in the problem question given. Legal issue, most of the students understand as repeating the facts of the problem question, which is wrong. You should not do that. You're not supposed to repeat the facts of the problem question. You should just say what is the legal issue. For example, the legal issue can be whether or not there is, in case of EU institution, if EU is democratic, that can be a legal issue. Whereas repeating the facts of the problem question or repeating the essay question is not statement of a legal issue. Rule would be to discuss the applicable law. Application in problem questions would be to apply the law to the facts of the case and make arguments all possible arguments that there can be in the problem question. And in case of essay question, you need critical analysis. Critical analysis is usually arguments for and against the essay question. Conclusion would be to sum up your main analysis and conclude. Remember that your goal in a problem question is always to discuss all the possible legal issues that come up. It has to be at least 80% of legal issues that you have identified and successfully addressed and provided critical analysis for a first class. Today's focus will be EU institution and democratic deficit, because there is always a question about this in EU law exams, so I thought it would be good to revise this topic and give you some tips about what kind of arguments you can make in an essay question about this. Usually you get an essay question. An essay question would say something like, is EU democratic? First of all, you need to talk about the EU institutions in an essay question like this. So list the EU institutions and then talk about each one of them, what they do, and whether or not they are democratic. European Parliament, European Commission, European Council, Council of the EU, and Court of Justice of the European Union. European Parliament is participating in the legislative process, so they make laws. Commission proposes legislation, so it should be discussed that European Parliament does not initiate legislations, but it discusses it and passes it. Not independently though. Commission is the one that proposes legislations, and European Parliament has to pass it. The Council of Europe and Parliament together have to adopt regulations and directives according to Article 289 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. European Parliament members are directly elected since 1979. If you are an EU citizen, you have probably voted in EU elections. So we directly elect members of the European Parliament. But the problem is that these elections, European Parliament elections, have a low turnout, so not all citizens go and vote. There is right of petition. EU citizens can submit a request to the European Parliament according to Article 227 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, showing direct participation of citizens in governance. So you need to argue, according to these facts that I have just given you, is European Parliament democratic or not? Then Council of the EU, which makes final decisions on legislations after the European Parliament. It has legislative and budgetary functions, but the problem which could be argued to make it undemocratic is that there is too many steps of delegation. Voters have to delegate responsibilities to local parliaments, and parliament delegate responsibilities to ministers. So Council of the EU is very far away from an average voter in the European Union. Lacks transparency, there's too much delegation of power. So European citizens are so far away from the Council of the EU that it can be described as undemocratic. Also, their members are not directly elected. Then European Council consists of heads of state of government and the president of the Commission. Has no legislative powers, has powers to initiate changes in treaties, shapes EU strategic direction, it's not directly elected, lacks accountability to EU citizens, and its decision-making process is not transparent, despite having a significant impact on EU citizens. So the fact that European Council is not transparent and it's not directly elected shows that it's undemocratic. You need arguments on both sides. You need to say why it is democratic and why it is not democratic. You need to be neutral and make arguments on both sides for each institution. The Commission operates independently, promotes general interests of the Union, power to initiate legislation. So when a new law is initiated in European Union, it has to come from the Commission. No other institution has a power of initiating any kind of legislations. Supervises implementation of the EU law, power to administer the budget, and composed of representatives from each member state, who are not directly elected. So it can be argued that the Commission has highest power of all in European Union, and their members are not directly elected. And it's not transparent how they work. If you ask an average EU citizen what is the Commission and what they do, they will not know, most likely, because EU citizens are not very involved in the governance of the European Union, which is an argument against the democratic governance of the EU. So you need to make both sides of the argument and say why the Commission is democratic and why it is not democratic. Checks and balances. Article 263 and Article 265 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, EU institutions can judicially review and challenge each other's decisions. So if European Commission makes a decision, European Council can challenge it, and so on. That's a good thing. That's actually a very democratic process, and all democratic states have checks and balances. This system creates checks and balances between institutions, and it is very, very important to have it in a democratic society. So, is EU democratic? There are arguments on both sides, and your job is not to say whether or not it is democratic. Your job is to identify both sides of the argument and cite relevant cases or relevant journal articles, like cite some kind of evidence that backs up your arguments, because you cannot just say things. You have to back up your arguments with something. And here are some main arguments that you could argue. EU is criticized for democratic deficit. This is a fact, and you have to state it. Major EU institutions do not have elected members. That means that it's not democratic. No elected members directly by the citizens means it's not democratic. EU citizens only elect European Parliament members, which means that European Parliament is more democratic than other institutions like European Commission. Also, EU institutions lack transparency and delegate powers. So they don't, if you ask an average EU citizen, they won't know what they do and how EU is governed, which means that it lacks transparency. And it's kind of like the governance is behind the curtains, which means that it lacks democracy. But a good argument against is that EU is not a country. It's a supranational organization, and it should not be held at the same democratic standards as if it was a state. It's not like a state like the UK, for example. It's an international organization, so the standards of democracy is not the same. For getting high grades in EU law, please follow these 3 steps. First, study with our materials. We have simplified study notes on our platform that will save you thousands of hours of reading and will focus your attention on what is important to know for getting high grades. You should book one-to-one tutoring sessions. It's extremely important, because without one-to-one tutoring sessions, most of our students are not able to get first class. It's extremely important for a first class. And attend the free revision classes like this one. If you go to tutoring on our platform, you have two options, one-to-one and group classes. Group classes is this one, and you should attend all of them. And for one-to-one classes, it's highly recommended if you have an ambition to get a first class. So thank you very much for attending this class.